God to be found? It's the fundamental question that confronts. On 3 of the 6 Sundays of Lent, we hear the same gospel every year, regardless of which lectionary cycle that we're in, that are recounted in all 3 synoptic gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which always for us is a key indicator of importance when it's something so major that all the evangelists capture it. On the first Sunday, the temptation of Jesus in the desert. On Palm Sunday, we always hear the story of the entrance into Jerusalem and the Passion of the Lord. Today, we always hear the account of the Transfiguration. And at first glance, this one seems a little out of place. The temptation and the Passion both seem Lenten. But the Transfiguration, doesn't that seem more Eastery? So what is it exactly that the Church is trying to highlight today? As always, we should look. In our first reading from the book of Genesis, we hear the story of the covenant that God makes with Abraham. And there's 3 takeaways we can make. The childless Abraham, that he will make of him a great nation with more descendants than he can number. And we see the heroic faith of Abraham in response to this, who believes what God tells him and acts accordingly at every turn. Secondly, his descendants will have a land for themselves. The third one is more hidden. I find it regrettable that for the sake of brevity, and that's why I would never dare preach long, right? But out of brevity, the Church, by omitting some middle verses. It kind of gets the beginning, progresses, and then jumps to the end of the passage. But today, I think the verses that are omitted are really important for our clear context. So right after we hear that the sacrifice is made and Abraham goes into, here's what God says. Then the Lord said to Abram, know for certain that your descendants will reside as aliens in a land not their own, where 100 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation they must serve, and after this they will go out with great wealth. You, however, will go to your ancestors in peace. You will be buried at a ripe old age. Here, for the wickedness of the Amorites is not yet complete. So these middle verses speak of a time in a land that is not their own, a reference to Egypt, speaks of a judgment on that nation and the departure of Abraham's people. Of course, all point to the Exodus. So if we take this back to the gospel, what's happening in chapter 9 of Luke's Gospel, of which what we hear today is part of it? At the end of chapter 9, we hear of the resolute turn of Jesus towards Jerusalem. And why do I say resolute? Because this is a really big deal highlighted in Luke's Gospel, even more than Matthew. 10 chapters following in Luke's Gospel will be what scholars call the travel narrative. And they call it this because Jesus is on a straight line from this point on to Jerusalem. And this isn't just a narrative going. Luke will tell us at every turn, and his eyes were fixed on Jerusalem. And by the way, don't forget, he's traveling to Jerusalem. And after he did this, he resumed traveling to Jerusalem. Luke really wants a collision course with Jerusalem. Early on in his gospel, he's been traveling around in Galilee, town to town, preaching the word, healing, doing exorcisms. But now, Jerusalem heard. He is on a straight line to the cross. And so are we. This event that we hear in today's gospel is the setup for the turn to Jerusalem. It's literally a pivot point in the gospel. So what is it that is so significant about the transfiguration? First, we hear they climb Mount Tabor. And always in the scriptures, when you hear a climbing of the mountain, you can expect a theophany to happen. God. You climb the mountain to encounter God. The most famous example of this is Moses climbing Mount Sinai to receive the law in the book of Exodus. Just the attendants up the mountain with him, Peter, James, and John. And they go up to encounter. It's incredible. Moses and Elijah appear, the pillars of Judaism, the giver of the law, and the greatest of all the prophets. But Jesus himself becomes radiant. Peter sees this and is terrified and tries to think of something to say. And as usual, open mouth, insert foot. Let's build tents for Jesus, Elijah, and Moses. Now he says this, and all the harshness, Luke comes to say, and while he was still speaking, no. Stop talking. The divine interruption comes in. While he was still speaking, and the voice of the Father speaks, "This is my chosen Son, listen to him." Peter, stop talking and listen. And after this, Moses and Elijah are no longer. What's happening? They've gone up the mountain to encounter God, and boy, have they. God shows himself, but Jesus is highlighted. Moses or Elijah. Peter, James, and John are right. Moses and Elijah. Old Testament expectation leads to expect a new Moses and the return of salvation, and they both appear. And God says, no, don't worry about Moses and Elijah. Look at my Son. Now, the great irony is that Peter is half right, not in the way he thinks when he wants to build tents. The construction of tents for the sacred has a special significance for the Jewish people. In the Feast of Tabernacles, every year, people lived in the tents for the feast to remember the time that Israel spent in the desert as part of the Exodus. But there was one tent, the meeting tent, or the tent of the dwelling. This would abide, and Moses would go in to speak with the Lord. And how did God indicate his presence? When the God was there and the people would halt their journey. When the cloud withdrew, the people packed up the tents and resumed the journey. At the Annunciation, envelops or overshadows the Blessed Virgin Mary, and the divine conception happens in her womb. The pregnant Mary becomes the Ark of God. Now, years later, God again shrouds them in cloud. Listen to him. Jesus glows with radiant glory, much as Moses the tent after encountering God in the cloud. He would come out and so now Jesus is glowing in the midst of the cloud, but it's different. It's a reflection. It's Jesus himself. Why? It is the tabernacle of God. Here, God says, is my presence amongst you to be found. Jesus, and God is once again gathering a people around himself to be on the move. He is gathering a new and faithful Israel, those who will respond to his word. Where are they going? To Jerusalem, yes, but to more important, not out of Egypt, but out of the reign of sin and slavery to death and earthly bondage, and towards the cross, where the gates open. To prepare for this exodus, Jesus, like the people of Israel, must make the Passover. But it will not on doorposts and lintels. It will be his own blood that is shed. The Paschal Lamb will institute the Eucharist to set his people free from slavery to sin. As the people observance of the Passover, so will Jesus instruct his people, do this in remembrance of me. Moment shows his glory. They get a glimpse. In Jerusalem, that glory will be veiled. His face won't be shining with marred with dirt and blood and spittle. But it is one and the same Jesus, the tabernacle of his people. The hint Jesus waiting glory. It points, as Paul says, to our glorified bodies to come. That speaks to what waits. But for now, if we want to know the real thing, we must go to Jerusalem. We must go to the cross. Our attention on the importance of the Eucharist that we are about to celebrate. But it should also open our eyes to the exodus that we are called to if we are to be disciples of Jesus. The very Israel's departure from Egypt, Jesus' exodus, which Luke quotes openly, tells us that Moses and Elijah were discussing. But it speaks also to our departure from this world. to our heavenly homeland. This is what that while others are preoccupied with earthly things, we must remember that our citizenship is not here, it is in heaven. Pilgrim people passing through, and therefore we must stay lightly packed so that we can keep. Pilgrimage must continue until we arrive in the promised land of heaven. But until he is with us, he is not found in a tent in the body of his Son, the same body that will be offered up on the cross, the same dwelling, body and blood, soul and divinity in the tabernacle, in the church. The same body and blood from above to sustain us for our journey, so that God may set up his tent, his dwelling